It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
How many of us take the time to ponder the source of the opinions and conclusions we consider to be the truth? Who or what source or sources were responsible for coloring the lens through which we see the world? How bad does the state of the world have to get on countless fronts before each of us summons the courage to fully face verifiable realities? What will it take for each of us to abandon ideology, preconception, and program bias so that we see what actually is? What will it take? On this commercial-free news hour, I won't ask you to believe me, never. What I do ask is this: if you honestly care about the truth, about your future and the future of your children, then investigate every frontline report I give. Honest investigation, without ideology, preconception, or bias. And consider this: while the power structure-controlled media sources are doing their best to distract you with every imaginable form of orchestrated drama, our planet's life support systems are unraveling. And remember this as well: denial of this fact will not alter the reality itself. In this broadcast, more breaking reports that make clear the worst-case scenario climate estimates were all wrong. Here's the reality: such reports fell far short of how bad things really are. What is the response of global power structures? Total desperation. Which countries and governments are pushing us all toward global conflict and chaos, indeed global omnicide? How many will choose to summon the courage, again, to face verifiable facts, to face the truth? How many will still choose to remain the fearful followers of fascist empires? This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour for May 19th, 2018. This commercial-free program is brought to you by geoinženjeringwatch.org and is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670, 6 to 7, Sunday mornings from 7 to 8. Global Alert News is under the recent top stories and radio sections. As always, if you're in the Redding, Shasta County area, free geoengineering awareness-raising materials can be ordered from the homepage of Geoinženjering. Moving on, social media has been and is completely clamping down on any and all information geoinženjeringwatch.org tries to make available. We know we're not the only ones being targeted, obviously, but we are being heavily targeted. Even my emails, incoming and outgoing, now take from many minutes to hours, sometimes days, to be received or sent. Some, of course, are not received or successfully sent at all. For all the paid cowards that are carrying out the bidding of their social media paymasters by censoring the flow of essential information, consider this: you're directly participating in your own demise. Not somewhere down the road and over the horizon, but in the very near term. The ship is sinking, and all of the mindless, honorless order followers who carry out the bidding of the power structure are helping to push us all over the edge. To be clear, there's no return from the destination the current path leads to. We must change course. Vaccination update: the total insanity of injecting highly toxic heavy metals and chemicals into our bodies continues. Here's a new report. California school immunization requirements updates coming. A number of changes are coming to the California school immunization requirements, although the changes become effective July 1st, 2019. It's not too early to start preparing. Starting in 2019 and 2020 school year, changes to the California school immunization requirements regulations include, but are not limited to, requiring 2 rather than 1 dose of chickenpox. Kindergarten entry vaccinations required. 7th grade advancement vaccinations required. K through 12 admission or transfer vaccinations required. Requiring 2 MMR doses, already proven harmful. Vaccination that's already proven harmful. Now they want 2 doses of that vaccination, and 3 hepatitis B vaccine doses at admission or transfer, more uniformly throughout K through 12. Medical exemptions for new admissions may be signed only by a California licensed MD or DO. 3, each temporary medical exemption may be issued for no more than 12 months. What's this all about? It's about ensuring that the now proven vaccinations are forced on all of us and our children. That's what it's about. If you're still caught in the total denial, program denial, because the medical industry personnel are paid to make you believe this, that vaccinations are not harmful, time to face reality. If you care at all about your child, you owe them an investigation of this issue. You owe them. And how hard is it to figure out that injecting toxic heavy metals into a human body will do damage? How hard is that to figure out? We're living in an insane asylum, an absolute insane asylum in which very few care about the truth. Another headline on the vaccinations. Summer camps now requiring vaccinations. Summer camps. Not all of them, but some of them. Everyone conforming to the collective insanity. This is societal collective insanity. Mass conformity to that insanity. And by the way, for those who truly care about the greater good, activism for the greater good is an everyday endeavor, not a whenever you feel like it, or once a month when you're particularly angry about something. We are fighting for our lives at this point. That requires doing what we can every day. I realize everyone's in a different situation. Some are fighting just to keep their head above the waterline. But how many people in our society, as I've stated so many times in previous broadcasts, are struggling like hamsters on a treadmill going nowhere because they've encumbered their life with every form of material possession they can possibly purchase? If that's the position you're in, you need to correct your compass heading and help in the fight for the greater good. Mainstream media, we must hold them accountable as well as accomplices in the crimes of cover-ups on countless fronts. This can be done in many ways. See the homepage of geoinženjering.org for the activist suggestions link. Learn more about what you can do to hold mainstream media accountable for their assistance with the criminal cover-up of countless power structure crimes, including climate engineering. Moving on, I want to cover as many headlines as I can. They're coming far too fast to even begin to go over in my weekly broadcast. Consider this headline from newscientist.com. I want to go over the collapse in the environment and then the geopolitical desperation that's going on. That's the response to a collapsing biosphere. Remember that. Biosphere collapse, power structure desperation, push toward World War III. Remember that. Here's the headline. Tourism is 4 times worse for the climate than we thought. No, it's 4 times worse than you were willing to tell us. Some of us always knew. We've always reported this. It's far worse than we've been told, exponentially worse than we've been told. Now, because it's becoming impossible to hide, some are admitting to that fact. From this report, to help stop global warming, cancel that round-the-world holiday. Tourism has expanded so rapidly that it now accounts for 8% of the greenhouse gases we belch into the air. That's up to 4 times previous estimates. And of course, no mention of climate engineering and the fact that airline industry seems to be subsidized in order to keep as many jets in the air as possible, in order to keep as many spray dispersions in the air as possible. And we know commercial carriers are being used. We know this. We have photographs of the nozzles mounted on their pylons aimed into the exhaust jet stream. Don't believe me. Look at our data. Go to geoinženjering.org. Look at the homepage. Look at the 20-page fact and photo summary booklet. You can look at a full PDF of that on the homepage and look at the nozzles yourself on commercial carriers. Not that commercial personnel, they're not involved. We don't believe. No data to indicate that. But their aircraft are positively being used remotely for these operations. All part of the scenario, not being mentioned by articles like this, of course. The article continues, a wealth problem. Tourism is growing as people get richer. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the U.S. is the biggest source of tourism emissions due to both its own citizens traveling elsewhere and people from elsewhere visiting the U.S. But other nations are catching up fast. The strongest growth was seen in emerging economies such as China, India, and Brazil, as wealthy citizens seek to travel to exotic destinations. This won't continue much longer, one way or the other. You can quote me on that. The reckoning is coming. Another headline from AccuWeather.com. Northern India on alert for scorching heat waves set to last into June. From this report, this pattern could hold until the arrival of monsoon rain, meaning dangerous heat will grip some areas for another month. before lasting relief arrives. In addition to the heat, residents will have to contend with the poor air quality, which is a common problem this time of year. Lots of pollution in India, but massive amounts of climate engineering fallout coming down through the air column there, here, and everywhere else. And consider for the temperatures, for those in parts of the U.S. that have had a cool spring, the departure from normal temperature maps for the spring of 2018 shows one blue below normal region on the entire planet. Guess where? In the eastern half, where the highest population levels are for the country that has a military that's 10 times as big as the next 10 militaries combined. Thus, it has the biggest climate engineering fleet, and they are keeping that portion of the population confused and divided as to the true state of the climate. Do we think it's a coincidence that the only blue below normal region on the whole globe for the last month and a half was the most populated regions of the U.S.? Is that a coincidence? Think again. Consider this headline from the UK Independent. Hundreds of fish species will be forced to migrate north to escape the effects of climate change. This is the warming planet and the oceans that are superheating. If you don't believe that, you haven't done any research. It's happening. In regard to aquatic ecosystem collapse, I speak firsthand, at least for a number of regions around the globe that I've been to, that I've dove at. I've been diving since I was 14 years old. I've dove in a number of regions, northern and southern hemisphere, 2 private expeditions to the Barrier Reef. I've seen this damage firsthand. It's happening. Consider this headline from multiple sources. Humans are causing massive changes in the locations of water around the world, NASA says. Now, really consider this headline. No acknowledgement of climate engineering, which is the single greatest disruptor of the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, but not a single word from NASA about that. Of course, from this report, a 14-year NASA mission has confirmed that massive redistribution of fresh water is occurring across Earth, with middle latitude belts drying and the tropics and higher latitudes gaining water supplies. The results, which are probably a combination of the effects of climate change, vast human withdrawals of groundwater, and simple natural changes. Let me stop right there. There is nothing natural about what's happening on our planet, and the paid liars that I already spoke about and that I'll elaborate on later in this broadcast, the paid liars at institutions like NASA are lying. They're absolutely lying, and I'll go into this in great detail later in this broadcast. Stay with me. No mention of climate engineering, in which the hydrological cycle can be completely and is being completely manipulated. Just like President Johnson said in the statement that is at the beginning of every single Global Alert News program, he who controls the weather controls the world. That's where we are at. Continuing from this report, these changes could have profound consequences if they continue, pointing to a situation in which some highly populous regions could struggle to find enough water in the future. Weather warfare happening now and been happening for 70 years. Another headline from the UK Guardian. This headline report, water shortages to be key environmental challenge of the century, NASA warns. Again, from that report, freshwater supplies have already seriously declined in 19 global hotspots from China to the Caspian Sea. A reminder, as I've stated so many times, the climate engineers, the weather makers, can control the spigot wherever they want. It is not a coincidence that every single Middle Eastern country that was named, this is another reminder. I know for the last few weeks I've been reminding everyone of this. I want it to sink in. Every single Middle Eastern country named immediately after 9/11 as targets by our government, named by Wesley Clark, every single one underwent a once in 1,000 year drought as they were destabilized and toppled. Leaders of those countries, in some cases Iran, the country that now is in the crosshairs of the United States and Israel, more on that later in this broadcast, their leaders on the floor of the UN stating clearly on the record that their country's rain was being cut off by NATO weather modification programs. That's reality. And we wonder who's provoking who? We wonder who is the real terrorist in this equation. Another headline from multiple sources. Worst case climate change scenario is even worse than we thought. How many times have I said that? And I said there would come a point when it couldn't be hidden any longer. and we are transitioning into that point. From that report, the phrase, quote, worse than we thought, end quote, is a cliche when it comes to climate change. But guess what? It's way worse than we thought. Don't believe me on any of these headlines. If you're still caught in some sort of false narrative that feels good to believe because we all hate Al Gore, and you're parroting that narrative, for example, I hear still the coming ice age narrative. On what planet? What planet exactly is that happening on? Because it's not this planet. I'm asking people who are parroting such narratives without having done any honest investigation. You're harming the effort to expose and halt climate engineering by parroting the exact narrative that the power structure and the geoengineers want you to parrot. Please do some real research, correct your compass heading, and help us to credibly expose this issue before it's too late. Help us. Another headline from the UK Guardian and other sources: mysterious rise in banned ozone-destroying chemical shocks scientists. Like all these previous headlines, they're shocked. They didn't know. It's worse than they thought. How come we knew? How come we knew at geoengineeringwatch.org and have said the same thing for a decade now, nearly a decade? I said it for much before the site was even started in 2009. Our conclusions have never changed because they're based on unvarnished frontline data. And now those in academia are having to admit to some of what's going on, even though they're still trying to find scapegoats for what's going on. So now we have this headline. If we go back 3 or 4 months, we had the false ozone layers recovering headline. And we stated at the time that was patently false. Then came the headlines that, oh, we made a mistake. The ozone layer really isn't recovering like we thought. Now we have this headline: mysterious rise in banned ozone-destroying chemical shock scientists. Scapegoating, still scapegoating. From this report, CFCs have been outlawed for years, but researchers have detected a new production somewhere in East Asia. Yeah, let's point the finger at someone else. It's either China or Russia, but it's never the US and its allies. Because then the US population might begin to open their eyes. So our prostitutes in media, prostitutes, continue to toe the official lie for academia, who toes the lie for the power structure. From this report again, unless the culprit is found and stopped, the recovery of the ozone layer, which protects life on Earth from damaging UV radiation, could be delayed. Now, it's not being delayed, it's disintegrating. I challenge anyone, search geoengineering is destroying the ozone layer, and read about what geoengineering is recognized as doing to the ozone layer. You cannot spray particulates into the atmosphere without destroying the ozone layer. That's exactly what's happening. Doesn't matter whether those particulates come from a volcano, a smokestack, or the back of a jet. Doing so, filling the atmosphere with particulates, has an incredibly detrimental effect on the ozone layer, along with other factors. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but I'm saying academia is absolutely nothing more or less than a tool for the power structure to deceive populations. On that note, consider this report: debriefing academicians, unpaid intelligence informants. That's what they are. From this report, listen carefully. U.S. empire builders, whether engaged in political or military activities, depend on information, especially regarding who to back and who to subvert, who should receive diplomatic support and who should receive financial and military resources. Debriefed academics identify, quote, moderate and, quote, radical adversaries, as well as personal and political vulnerabilities. U.S. officials are especially interested in academic gatekeepers who exclude, quote, anti-imperialist critics, activists, politicians, and governmental officials. At times, U.S. State Department officials claim to be sympathetic, quote, progressives who oppose, quote, Neanderthals in their institution in order to elicit inside information from academic informants. Debriefing is a widespread practice that involves numerous academics from major universities and research centers, as well as non-governmental activists and editors of academic journals and publications. Academic participants in debriefing frequently do not publicize their reporting to the government. Most likely they share their reports with other academic informers. All claim they are merely sharing research and diffusing information for, quote, science and to further, quote, human values. Academic informers always justify their collaboration with governments as providing a clear and more balanced picture to, quote, our policymakers, ignoring the, quote, predictable, destructive outcomes likely to ensue. Another subheading in this report, academics in the service of empire. Academic informants never study, collect, research, or publicize reports on U.S. covert, overt, or clandestine policies, and thus they are collaborating with empire builders. U.S. officials have no interest in debriefing, quote, academics conducting anti-imperialist research. In other words, those who will say what the empire wants them to say are assisted, those who won't aren't. Another subheading in this report, academic informants, what do they want? What do they get? Academic informers engage in debriefing for various reasons. Few do so simply because they share the politics and ideology of the empire builders and feel it's their duty to serve. The great majority are established academics with ties to research centers who inform because it fattens their CV, i.e. their resume, which helps secure grants, prestigious appointments, and awards. That's how it works. Those who serve the empire are rewarded. That's how it works. Continuing, academics who collaborate with empire are allowed to speak at public conferences, especially to students and private settings. They report to the State Department. Almost like agents, aren't they? And those within the system, again, who serve that system are rewarded. Continuing, many academics believe they can influence and change government policy. They seek to impress self-identified, quote, progressive officials with their inside knowledge. They invent innocuous academic categories and concepts to attract graduate students to further collaboration with imperial colleagues. All about empire. It's all about empire. Final statement from this report. What is clear in virtually all known experiences is that academic informers, quote, debriefings, strengthened the empire builders and complemented the deadly work of the paid professional operatives of the CIA, DEA, and the National Security Agency, as I've stated in broadcast after broadcast after broadcast. Academia, with few exceptions, has not only betrayed the human race, but indeed the entire web of life. If you're in the ranks of academia and you are helping to cover the tracks of the power structure with your silence and your denial, take a good long look in the mirror and ask yourself if your paycheck and pension is worth completely sacrificing any shred of morality. Ask yourself. Moving on, what about the so-called environmental organizations? Where are they? Hiding in the shadows. All of the major so-called environmental groups, hiding in the shadows. I've been over this again and again and again. Protecting their 501c3s, total hypocrisy. While climate engineering rages in the skies above, the single greatest environmentally destructive factor of all, and that's saying a lot. For those who want to believe there's nothing wrong with the planet, everything's natural and fine except for climate engineering, that's not rational. It's not rational. We have sacked the planet, decimated the planet in the geologic blink of an eye. For the record, I just suffered through a presentation by the so-called Bioneers, an organization I have long since passed on mountains of geoinženjering information to. In this presentation by this group, just aired on the completely controlled so-called free speech TV station, the Bioneers speaker ranted on and on for 30 plus minutes without citing a single relevant frontline fact and without giving any sort of, quote, call to duty toward their group. Just factless, feel-good fluff. Nothing more. All the while, planet Earth is sinking by the day. Moving on. This is from nuclearnews.net, this shocking report, a chronology of dire warnings that have been completely suppressed by official sources and academia to this day. Title, Nuclear Radiation Depletes the Ozone Layer, Will Eventually Destroy Planet's Oxygen. By the way, to make it clear, no ozone layer, no life on Earth. That's simple. We have very little time left. The single greatest destructive factor, on top of many other factors which this report will outline, is still climate engineering. That's why I'm focused on the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat, but all of these factors I'm outlining are all a part of the picture. Bear with me. 1957, Walter Russell published his book, Atomic Suicide, whose principal message was that the development of the nuclear weaponry and nuclear industry, if continued, would eventually destroy the planet's oxygen. Game over. How many people ask me all the time, why would they do this to themselves? And they can't bring themselves to face reality because the proverbial they, in this case the central bankers or those who control them, would never do this to themselves, right? Wrong. Wrong. They are not sane. They have done so many things to themselves and the rest of us, one would need days to begin to cover it. Bear with me through this report. The element of surprise, which could delay the discovery of the great danger and thus allow more plutonium piles to come into existence, is the fact that scientists are looking near the ground for fallout dangers. The greatest radioactive dangers are accumulating from 8 to 12 miles up in the stratosphere. The upper atmosphere is already charged with death-dealing radioactivity, for which it has not yet sent us the bill. It is slowly coming, and we have to pay for it in the coming years. Even if all atomic energy plants ceased today, no stopping this train. I've said that over and over and over. Next, 1982, 1984, two German reports conclude that radioactive krypton, which is released in the daily operation of nuclear plants and throughout the reprocessing of used reactor fuel elements, is affecting the distribution of the electric fields in the atmosphere, destroying Earth's life support systems. Continuing, 1987, the ozone hole is twice as large as the U.S. It is discovered that ozone is not only diminishing over the South Pole, but globally. Geoinženjering.org has reported on this over and over and over. The first time we published our research findings, our site was taken down in 15 minutes, was taken down 8 times in the next 3 days. We had to switch servers, more security. This is clearly an issue those in power will try to hide from public view as long as possible. 1987, 1988, consensus has it that various man-made chemicals are the sole cause of ozone breakdown. Nothing natural about this. For those who claim this is all natural cycle, delusion. That's delusion. Continuing from the report, especially compounds of CFCs and bromine from various sources, and there was an attempt to implicate hairspray in refrigerators. A leading authority on the ozone problem, NASA's Dr. Robert Watson, admitted many scientists were, quote, baffled by findings of ozone depletion, even in areas where CFC action was negligible. He called the extent of the hole's growth absolutely unexpected. It's not unexpected, and it's not CFCs, as they just admitted to in this finding. CFCs are a problem, but mathematically a smaller part of the problem, climate engineering. That's the elephant in the room that's not being acknowledged. Continuing from this report, April 6, 1989, scientists report yesterday that for the first time they have detected an increase in, quote, biologically relevant levels of ultraviolet UV radiation reaching the ground as a result of the ozone hole over Antarctica. This is the first indication that the depletion of ozone is beginning to cause, quote, potentially harmful effects that have long been predicted. This is where they began geoengineering as a fully deployed operation first, over the polar regions. That's where the ozone depletion showed up first, over the polar regions. Moving on, 1992, both NASA and the World Meteorological Society reported 10 to 25% ozone depletion measured over the northern United States, Canada, Europe, and Antarctic. And the ozone hole is now 3 times the size of the United States, still growing. Increased UV appears to be suppressing phytoplankton's productivity. Exactly what we've stated at geoinženjering.org. Slaughtering plankton. By the way, no plankton, no life on Earth. Very simple. All of these are converging at once. 1994, an article in the German Journal of Science argues that the nuclear industry is responsible for the hole in the ozone. Again, it's not just the nuclear industry. The authors explain that radioactive gases like krypton-85 from nuclear plants and from the recycling of spent fuel go straight up to the stratosphere, where they create water droplets from the moisture, which in turn form ice crystals, which enhance the destruction of the ozone hydrocarbons. Continuing, March 1996, the World Meteorological Agency reports, quote, the extremely worrying, end quote, development of unprecedented 45% ozone thinning over parts of the northern hemisphere. How many people ever heard that on mainstream media? It's much worse now. This is exactly what we reported over and over and over, and we have denial coming from, quote, academia, the paid liars, all the reasons I already cited, their collaboration and collusion with the empire builders, bought, sold, and paid for in exchange for their paychecks and pensions, which will not matter much longer. Final excerpt from this report. Research from the Antarctic Marine Living Resources Program find, quote, krill abundance in the Antarctic Peninsula region is down 60 to 90% since the early 1980s. And this was as of 1997, 21 years ago. How much worse is it now? The oceans are dying. They're converting to what is known as Canfield Ocean, a superheated, lifeless, oxygenless, stratified, and dead ecosystems. That's where we're headed right now. We're there. In many senses, we're already there. And yet the denial continues. Now, with biosphere implosion accelerating by the day and being already extremely advanced, as I've stated over and over, what happens? Power structure desperation. They know what's coming. They know. And their psychotic behavior only gets worse. And for the so-called patriotic, blind, flag-waving, willfully ignorant citizens of this country, and that's not patriotism again, that's tyranny. Blind, unquestioning allegiance to an empire is not patriotism, that's tyranny. What maneuvering did we see from the increasingly desperate and psychotic U.S. government, U.S. empire from last week? Here's a headline. North Korea cancels summit due to U.S. military drills on their border. Why wouldn't they cancel the summit with South Korea based on that? Would we meet with Korea if they were conducting military operations in Tijuana or across the border in Canada? Of course not. But the immense hypocrisy of this country, unimaginable hypocrisy from the majority. I realize there are exceptions, and I'm grateful for those exceptions, but the majority still willfully going along with the completely hypocritical, tyrannical, and incredibly dangerous behavior of this government. Now we see this theater, and that's all it is. It's a theater. This good guy, bad guy theater with the war criminal, Mr. Bolton, playing bad cop and other administration officials playing good cop and trying to confuse and divide the U.S. population as to what's truly happening. It's all theater. As the biggest and most dangerous military-industrial complex in the world tries desperately to survive by creating more global conflict. That's what's happening. And all of it being pushed by biosphere collapse. One more headline I don't want to overlook. For the record, the criminals continue to be moved into the rapidly growing population of the swamp, not out of it. Consider this headline. I went to prison for disclosing the CIA's torture. Gina Haspel helped to cover it up. That statement was from John Carrico, the incredibly courageous individual who blew the whistle on the illegal, immoral, and completely twisted torture programs being conducted by our country, and the new nomination from this administration, Gina Haspel, helped to cover that up. The only person to go to jail was the whistleblower. Yes, the swamp is being filled, not drained. Be clear on that. It's getting worse. All administrations, all criminal, all bad. Getting worse, though. All part of the orchestrated theater directed by the power structure. If you're caught up in that theater, you're missing the point. More headlines. Is the current demonization of Iran any different from what was done to Iraq? Again, consider this headline. Trump's plan to seize Iraq's oil. It's not stealing. We're reimbursing ourselves. I want people to consider the absurdity of that headline. We destroyed Iraq on false premises. One of the targets named by Wesley Clark immediately after 9/11, completely illegal invasion, destroyed their country, and now they have to pay us for destroying their country. Think how absurd that is. From the false flag that the Vietnam War was launched with, to 9/11, to the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to all the countries that have been toppled and occupied and destroyed by our country, how long will Americans continue to accept the official lies? Willful blindness. How long will Americans continue to pretend that nothing's happening in their skies? To pretend that having chronic asthma, allergies, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, autistic kids is all normal? How long will this sort of willfully blind, comatose behavior continue? How much longer? We don't have much time. That's a mathematical fact. As far as the U.S. goes, the quote, let's bomb them and take their oil attitude is nothing new. It's nothing new. The U.S. government has been interfering with dozens of countries for many decades. In the case of Iran, by the way, for 65 years. Let's go over a headline on that note. CIA-assisted coup overthrows government of Iran, August 19, 1953. Business as usual, over and over. And as I went over in previous broadcasts, this has been part of the plan that's being pushed by Netanyahu from Israel and our government. They still are salivating to take over all the Middle East and the resources that are there. And that's the bottom line. It's not about safety. It's not about security. It's about resources. When will the American population face that? But for many of the American population, and some that I even know, when it gets right down to it, these are acquaintances that I've long since severed, by the way. But with some, their attitude was this. Ultimately, they didn't really care who had to be invaded or toppled, so long as it would keep their own personal party going, their own personal fossil fuel fiesta. That's not morality. That's moral depravity. Moving on. The art of war, preparing for war, biosphere collapse, desperation of the power structure. Here's the headline. The art of war, U.S. fleet with 1,000 missiles in the Mediterranean. The fleet with more than 8,000 men on board has enormous firepower. The Truman, a supercarrier 300 meters long, equipped with 2 nuclear reactors, can launch 90 fighters and helicopters in consecutive waves. Its strike group, supplemented by 4 destroyers already in the Mediterranean, and some submarines can launch over 1,000 cruise missiles. All of this is yet more frontline examples of the suicidal behavior of our species. While the planet is imploding around us, the military-industrial complex doubling down on global conflict to try to amass the remaining resources to sustain itself until there's nothing left. Until there's nothing left. And who's on whose border all over the globe? Us, the United States, and its allies. Not that other countries are innocent or benign. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is, again, the destructiveness is in direct proportion to the size and strength of the power that's being wielded. And in the case of the United States, again, a military that's bigger than the next 10 biggest militaries combined. That's the most destructive force on the planet. That's exactly what we're seeing. Again, not my opinion. For those who have the courage to investigate actual facts, search how many countries the U.S. has invaded and or occupied in the last 100 years. Nearly 100. Moving on. Now, for those that have the courage to face the unvarnished truth head on, for those who have the courage to rise above ideology, preconception, and program bias, here's an unspoken headline report that the power structure-controlled criminal media in the U.S. will not cover accurately. Here's the headline. Israel slaughters unarmed Palestinian protesters while Trump administration shouts Hamas. From this report. And people ask, what does this have to do with climate engineering? Not that I'm restricted to talking about one issue, but for those that ask this, all of this is connected. All of it. The same people that are spraying us with toxic elements, injecting them into our bodies and telling us it's good for us, are the same people conducting these atrocities that I'm covering right now. Same people. And if you think that these people care any more about you than they do the Palestinians, you need to wake up. From this report, the Israeli military killed over 60 and wounded over 2,000 Palestinian protesters in one day, including, by the way, 19 international medical personnel that were clearly identifiable from their emergency assistance apparel. All of this from snipers across a barrier. There was no direct confrontation anywhere. This was simply a slaughter. Continuing from the report, all the while, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner opened the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. The Trump administration is misleadingly pointing the finger at Hamas to distract from Israel's crimes. And that's exactly what they are. While countries throughout the world harshly condemn the Israeli massacre, which is exactly what it was, however, the United States staunchly supported Israel, no surprise. In fact, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were in Israel while the IDF was slaughtering unarmed protesters, unarmed, remember that, in order to open the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Ivanka and Jared said nothing about the ongoing massacre of Palestinian civilians while they received blessings from a top Israeli state-backed racist rabbi who, by the way, once compared black people to monkeys. That's who they were with. Do we think that such people think any more of the Palestinians or any of the rest of us that aren't a part of their circle? Think again. The carnage being inflicted on unarmed Gazans is, of course, not over. Here's a new headline. Israeli airstrikes target militant sites in Gaza. Militant sites according to Israeli sources. And by the way, I'm not stating there's no militants in Gaza. I'm not saying that. For those who think dichotomously, please don't think that. Of course there are militants in Gaza and everywhere else. But when 60 innocent civilians are killed in a single day, 12 of them children, one of them 4 years old, 19 shot that were medical personnel, all of them shot by snipers who were never in any danger, as was the case with all the Israeli military, never any conflict, actual engagement, nothing, just slaughtering from a distance with snipers. That's what happened. From Gaza to Syria to Iran to Lebanon to the USS Liberty, Israel bombs whoever they want, whenever they want, and the U.S. government is giving the Israeli government over $10 million a day to do so. In fact, in 2016, and this is under the Obama administration, by the way, and as I stated, they're all criminals. Obama, Bush, Clinton, all the rest, all criminals. But in 2016, under the Obama administration, the U.S. approved a military aid package of $38 billion for Israel. And if you don't know the facts about Israelis' ruthless bombing, by the way, of the USS Liberty, show the courage to investigate. You will be shocked, I assure you. So, who is the tail that is wagging the dog in this equation? And for those who continue to blindly wave their flags of support for actions of our government and of Israel, your willful denial of verifiable facts only translates to a total lack of moral responsibility. That's simple. Another report I want to cover. This is from globalresearch.com. It's titled Forgiveness in the Face of Israel's Great Global Arrogance and Cruel Indifference Toward Palestinians. From this report, just a day after the Trump administration exited the nuclear accord with Iran, in a coordinated move, Israel violated the sovereign borders of Syria and bombed what it called, quote, Iranian positions there. The provocative nature of these attacks and bombings days later were to draw Syria and its allies into an escalating conflict. Israel's internal name for its strikes, quote, chess. Israel has attacked all bordering countries, some like Lebanon, repeatedly and for decades. It's occupied or annexed all of historic Palestine and the territory from Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. This is not because it had to do so to survive. It is because imperialism backed the formation of Israel on stolen Palestinian land, not as a homeland for Jewish people, but as an agent of war against Arab independence, their independence from the Rothschild Federal Reserve Central Bank. The Holocaust survivors who populated Israel were meant to fight and die for imperialism. To this end, the U.S. has given this country a total of 8.5 million people. They have given it $254 billion, $254 billion, $250 billion since its formation. Most of this is in sophisticated offensive weapons and spy equipment. Israel has been constantly at war with its neighbors for the benefit of U.S. imperialism. I would counter that it's not so much for the U.S. as much as for the New World Order globalists who control U.S. foreign policy. So, let's consider the immense hypocrisy the majority of Americans are either supportive of or are complacent about. the U.S. actions against any and every country that does not bow down to the demands of the U.S.-Israeli empire. But the moment anyone dares to criticize the U.S. and Israel for countless completely illegal and immoral acts of aggression, they are labeled as anti-patriotic or anti-Semitic. Some ask me what does all this have to do with geoengineering? And again, here is my answer. First, even if there was no connection to geoengineering, I would still sound out at the top of my lungs about such a ruthless slaughter as that which just was inflicted on the people of Gaza. Next, such an event, in fact, has everything to do with the ruthless, ongoing geoengineering, weather warfare, biological warfare assault. If the citizens of the U.S. and Israel believe, as I stated earlier, that their governments care any more about them than they do the people of Gaza, they are sadly mistaken. Does all of this mean, I want to say this again, does all of this mean I support other governments around the globe? Of course not. All are corrupt, all of them. The equation is not as simple as the simple-minded George W. Bush tried to make it when he said, quote, "You are either with us or you are with the terrorists." Those who think in such a manner are willfully blind to the wider horizon complexities. Let's continue to connect the dots, leading us all toward World War III. Headline, retired U.S. Colonel, Israel is dragging the United States into World War III. This is Lawrence Wilkerson, a retired Army colonel who now teaches at Washington area universities. He didn't hold back in his critique of where the status quo is leading the United States via its client state, Israel. Israel is in the process of plunging America into a war with Iran that could destroy what's left of the Middle East and ignite a third world war. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former chief of staff to the Secretary of State Colin Powell, warned in Washington approximately a week ago. Wilkerson, again, a retired Army colonel who now teaches at Washington area universities, didn't hold back in his critique of where the status quo is leading the United States via its client state, Israel. At the annual Israel Lobby Conference at the National Press Club, sponsored by the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs and the Institute for Research in Middle East Policy. One of the principal antagonists begging for war with Iran that Wilkerson identified was none other than Israel's Russian-born defense minister. And nowhere, Wilkerson states, does my concern about such a war focus more acutely at the moment than Syria. As the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, described it recently, the current rhetoric of the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel is pushing the region toward conflict with Iran. Think about that alliance, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Think about the hypocrisy with what we know about Saudi Arabia. They behead dissenters. They're nothing more than a despotic dictatorship, and yet they're an ally of the U.S. and Israel. Why? Because all of this is about empire, all of it. If that's not an unholy alliance, what is? What is? How many people even question Saudi Arabia being an ally of the U.S. and Israel? And what reflection is that on the U.S. and Israel? It exposes what they really are and what they're really about. Continuing, despite Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's incessant denigrations of Iran, including claiming that the greatest danger facing the Jewish state is the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country he accuses of fanning the flames of anti-Semitism, Colonel Wilkerson blew these accusations out of the park by using simple logic. He said this, quote, "The anti-Semitism bit from Netanyahu, of course, as we have heard today, is almost always a weapon of choice for Israeli politicians under stress. This is what they hurl out. In this case, at the country whose Jewish population, the country of Iran, that's what he's speaking about, whose Jewish population is the largest in the Middle East outside of Turkey and Israel, a Jewish population that lives in Iran in peace." Do we hear about that? Do Americans have any clue about that? The third largest Jewish population in the world lives in Iran peacefully? How many know that? This is my point from the beginning of this broadcast. So many people with so many opinions that have been fed to them from someone, somewhere with an agenda. Opinions and conclusions that are blindly followed. Waving flags, pretending to be patriotic, when in reality, it's simply programmed tyranny. How many will continue to follow that path? How many? I'm simply asking for any who truly claim to care about the truth, for any who claim to care about the future of their children, show a responsibility to the whole. Honestly investigate, abandon ideology, preconception, and bias. Face the truth, stand up for the truth, while it can still make a difference. Final statement from this report. Last year, a top Israeli general tasked with writing his country's defense policy admitted that Israel cannot take on Iran's military alone if the day should come that regional powers face off in a direct military confrontation, which is being pushed by the U.S. and Israel, by the way, saying that they would need to rely on the U.S. for assistance. The tail wagging the dog, as I already stated. Again, for the record, I want to state this. The geopolitical crimes and atrocities I am covering are completely connected to the climate engineering issue. So remember and consider this. Power brokers who control the militaries that are behind these crimes are the same sources of power that are conducting the climate engineering programs of global omnicide. Isn't it a paradox that even many who acknowledge the climate engineering assault then buy into the official propaganda that excuses away the atrocities committed by their governments against other nations and other populations? Truly a paradox. Remember, if you believe the U.S. government or the Israeli government ultimately cares about you any more than they do the Palestinians, you're sadly mistaken. We are further into the curve of total climate collapse than almost anyone comprehends. This involves biosphere collapse as well. As I have stated so many times, if we remain on the current course, it's game over. 70 years of climate engineering has completely derailed the climate system. 70 years of climate engineering has helped to mask the true severity of thermal energy buildup in the system. But now, as climate collapse begins to accelerate exponentially, that energy will become evident and unstoppable. As the climate and biosphere collapse accelerates, the desperation of despotic empires, including the U.S. and Israel, will also go exponential. Is there any hope of changing course? Yes. There is always hope, if and only if enough of the population finds the courage to fully face the truth. Enough courage to make their voice heard in this epic battle for the greater good. And in fact, not only for the greater good, but the very survival of life on Earth. See the activist suggestions link on the homepage of geoinženjeringwatch.org for instructions on exactly how you can help to turn the tide. Never give up, ever. Our will belongs to us, and us alone. Make your voice heard. This is Dane Wigington with geoinženjeringwatch.org. Until next week.